I'm Denise Stanley, and I'm head of knowledge exchange at ACM, but also I'm a founder director of the Clock programme. And I'm also a musician and songwriter. And I'm particularly interested in the kind of non-linear music, but also the influence of lyrics in relation to how does that fit in. So I've got a few interesting questions, and I'm going to hand over to Paul.
Right, hello, and my turn in that case. My name is Paul. I am what am I? I'm a teacher of FE games at the ACM. I've got an interest in this purely from the interest of having no knowledge of what wise and non-linear music is going to bring to what we're doing, but I just want to learn more and more. I've worked in the game prior to teaching. I worked in the games industry for about 12 to 15 years. I worked at Bullfrog, DI, UCM, Pepper's Ghost. It was a brilliant ride, and then I just suddenly thought, do you know what? I'm a bit fed up with crunch. I'm going to go into teaching, which proved to be not the best idea for avoiding crunch. But I am just, I'm just thoroughly enjoying teaching games, seeing what the students are bringing to it, and I just want to learn more and more and more. And wise and music and non-linear music is something that I've got no knowledge of whatsoever. So I just want to learn from you lot.
Fantastic. And I believe that just leaves us with Ash, who's our final guest tonight.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ash. I normally would have my camera turned on, but because I'm flying out tomorrow, I'm still frantically packing at the moment. I'm not in the studio. But yeah, it's really good to be on here. So I'm Ash. I'm a lead mentor here at ACM. I'm a songwriter, music producer, and audio engineer. My original, I should say, I started in my creative field growing up as a child into art. I'm heavily into art. I do a lot of art. I've got a degree in animation. Yeah, I'm really happy to be on this and just learn and understand more about all of this non-linear music and the various subjects, and hopefully just get a good idea of where everyone's at.
Very good. Well, excellent. Well, welcome everyone. The whole idea about these series of discussions that we have planned weekly for the next 6 weeks is just about taking a number of people from different backgrounds and being able to really explore these topics that we feel are really at the crux of technology, and where we see a lot of the creative industries going in the near future. And what we like to do at ACM is make sure that like any good discovery, sometimes you don't know what the end result is, but you just know that through experimentation, through collaboration, through getting like minds and differing minds together, that you can oftentimes come up with some exciting results. And so that's what the spirit of these discussions are about. And I thought what I would do, understanding that people are kind of coming at this from a wide range of backgrounds, is to just very briefly, kind of touch on the kind of idea of what nonlinear music is, give a couple examples of it, and then we just kind of break into some discussions about different ways that we think it can be used, different paths that we see it going in the future, and really hope to have it be less of a kind of lecture and more of a discussion, for instance, right in this case, a 9-way discussion, which I think would be really exciting. So one of the best ways I think to start in terms of trying to define nonlinear music, and again, it seems pretty simple on the face of it, because, well, linear music is clearly a piece of music that starts, say, at point A, and you go through, say, the way that we read music, left to right and then top to bottom, is a linear progression. And so trying to be a little bit more definitive than just saying not that, I thought I would go into some different examples of ways whether it be classical, whether it be through electronic music. And actually, when I was thinking about it today, I really feel that a lot of hip hop and turntablism, and also in techno, is a form of non-linear music, and I'll get to that in just a second. But so if we're looking at, say, classically, one way of creating non-linear music is basically to involve, say, patterns or loops that the performer may have choices where that can lead to path A or path B. They can repeat, they can jump, and it gives the audience and anyone who experiences the performance a different experience each time. And because it's not going to be recreated the same way. Now, this can, manifest itself in a lot of different ways, and that could say, for instance, Mozart had the dice game where he had a number of little musical fragments, little phrase fragments, and you could kind of roll dice or whatnot to choose what would go next. That's one form of it in a very kind of rudimentary way. But if you forward a couple hundred years to, say, Anna Klein, who I think it was in 2004, wrote a piece called Choke, which is for electroacoustic diffusion and saxophone. And the way that piece is constructed is that the electroacoustic set is a set of samples that the saxophone player actually pre-records, and it gets distorted and manipulated in real time to create kind of a textural background, and then comes up with a number of manipulations and say a secondary palette of multiphonics, growling, different types of things, and is instructed to do different layering of loops of different lengths. And so that gives you a nonlinear experience. Another example, though, say, would be in the early 2000s as well, was the small experimental electronic label Scam had an artist called Gescom who released an album called Mini Disc on a mini disc. And it was basically 45 tracks that are divided up into 88 parts. And the whole idea is that you put the mini disc on shuffle, and therefore you get a different experience each time. And again, that's if for those of you who might be into your kind of left field electronics, think Autechre on its more angular and experimental side. But it is a way for people to experience it a lot of different ways. Another way, and I don't know if this would count, but I kind of see it as such, is, say, Ligeti's poem Symphonique, which is a piece for 100 metronomes that are set at a different BPM. And it's evidently, if I recall the score correctly, 10 different musicians are responsible for 10 metronomes where they wind them up, the old mechanical ones that, click back and forth, and they set the BPMs. And basically it creates a whole cacophony of different, I guess some people might say a racket, but you start ending up hearing these different patterns, almost kind of the same way that when you hear, say, rain on like a tin roof or something like that, at first it sounds chaotic, but then you start noticing patterns and different waves. And so that I would say is nonlinear in the fact that it depends on who is setting the different tempos. When you mechanically wind it, have you wound it all the way? Because there will be different lengths for how long they continue to go, depending on how tightly they're wound. And then to, I guess, just leave it off, is one of the pieces that I did in nonlinear music was I collaborated with an artist who wanted to do a web installation where she was examining her nephew's suicide, where she felt that looking back on it, there could have been some clues that if they had noticed it at the time, they might have seen these as red flags. And so she wanted a 3x3 grid for her web installation where users click on a different square. They can click squares in any order they want. It reveals pieces of a larger picture, but she wanted music then to be incorporated. And so a different piece of music would, or a different layer rather, would be revealed for each. So depending on how one goes through the process of clicking through, you get a different experience musically. Now, that's just a very small sampling. Oh, I also mentioned hip hop. And I think the way that when, whether it be techno or hip hop, when turntablists have multiple records and they use the crossfader to cut back and forth, oftentimes they do so not just in terms of blending or mixing, but almost create a new piece from scratch in doing so. So these are a couple different ways that nonlinear music exists, but I think it's only really scratching the surface, and I think it's only really getting to the point now where I think we will start to see more and more development with it, particularly I think in games. So that's where I wanted to maybe kind of encourage Tony and or Elise to maybe speak of, you know, as you're getting involved in games and working in your development, how do you see music and sound in their implementation in games to have a nonlinear format?
Yeah, I would like to chime in on that, if you like. So nonlinear music finds itself in games as a useful solution to solve the problem of really how long does a game take to play. So when you're watching a film, for example, you'll know what the length is. I mean, some people gruel at, you know, sort of going to watch Avatar maybe and watch a 3-hour film, or, you know, or, you know, just they just want to know what the playing time is. But in a game, you have no idea what that playing time is. So somehow the music has got to accommodate that, you know, that open-ended approach, you know. But not only that, it needs to not sound repetitive if you're going to put a piece of music in, because that's one way, again, you can kill the engagement of somebody playing a game. So there's been many kinds of ways of trying to tackle that, that kind of puzzle, if you like. And so nonlinear music has found its way into that for those kind of reasons. So one of the tools we've been using, and this is something we teach at ACM, is by using kind of tools which we call middleware tools, because early on when we used to try to get, let's say, composed music into games, it used to be that you as a composer would compose something and then just give it to someone who with a good programming knowledge, and they would sort of integrate it into the game. The problem with that is that there is there's a bit of a gap between what the computer programmer who puts it into a game would interpret as the best place to put it and you composing the piece of music. So there's been a number of middleware tools created. One is called Fmod and another one's called Wwise, both of which we teach in the game audio pathway. And these tools are there to just help a composer best integrate it in the game without having that sort of middle person in the way to help it, find its way in there. But when it comes to nonlinear music side, there's a number of sort of terminologies which are really, really important to consider. So there's a lot of terminologies that's around. One is called interactive music. Sometimes you might hear that terminology. Another one is adaptive music as well, or adaptive sound. Another one is dynamic. And another one to bear in mind, and I'll bring Elise into it in this one, is generative and procedural based music as well. But I'll just touch a little bit on the first two, which is kind of the adaptive, how we just take care of the adaptive, let's say, because it's quite similar to what you just said. If a DJ was to go out with something like Ableton Live on a set and play it according to, what they feel the audience kind of wants at the time. And bear in mind, that's an important factor as well. The interactivity is really the audience's feeling and the DJ's feeling in terms of what they think is appropriate at that moment in time. And that's the same thing as in a game. So if you're in a game and you're playing your character moving around, you kind of want to know what that character's doing at the time and let that inform you to say what kind of music or how does the music respond to that. And so one of the solutions we use is to use a similar approach to what we do in Ableton, where we simply write a whole bunch of loops, and each of the loops can be in layers. And each of these layers can complement each other musically. And depending on what the character does in a game, you have the various combinations of loops firing off and on at that moment in time.
Almost kind of
So-
like the different uses of, like, say, follow commands, right? Is
Ye-
that what you're kind of thinking of the way
Yeah.
you jump to different things, use different probability factors for which one it'll jump to next, and things like that.
Absolutely. And I like the way you just use that term probability as well, because sometimes if it sounds quite repetitive if you're going back to that character and back again, and then the character does the same thing again, if you throw in like a bag of dice, to say, hey, next time we go around, let's play the music in a slightly different layered order, then that would also give us a sense of, oh, this is sounding fresh, So that's one way of doing it. And then the other way is similar to, again, like DJing, or something you might do in Spotify, where you arrange a set of playlists. So let's say you've got your favorite playlist of music. And then as a character, when you're moving around in a game, something might trigger so that you say, oh, I want to select playlist number 3 to suddenly come about. And then you're playing and you go on, and then maybe playlist number 2 comes in. And these middleware tools allow the game engine to communicate with the music, as it were, and seamlessly blend these types of music together, so that the player just feels like they're immersed in the game without feeling that, this has been selected, if you like, by a computer.
It's funny because that almost reminds me of some of the sound design I did for websites back in the early 2000s. Those lovely days where every single website wanted to have the non-skippable flash intro animation, and we thought we were so cool back then. And that was also pre-broadband, so I'm sure is annoying to everybody. But one of the things that I got hired to do a lot, because all of a sudden people wanted a lot more interactivity and kind of like an artistic slant for websites, is I was hired oftentimes to compose kind of background music for websites, but then to take it, to ratchet up the nerd factor, I would create rollover sounds for the menus for every different thing, but it also be in the same key as the music, or and have complementary tones or timbres to go along with it. So again, it felt like you were part of the music, and some people might not have even noticed that that's what it was. They probably just thought that was kind of part of the experience. Other people, I'm sure, notice, like, oh, wait a minute, when I roll over this, it sounds like this, but when I roll over this, and then inevitably people will start to play with it, and that's kind of what you want. You want people to start to mess with it. But that's really an interesting way for you to bring that up, Tony.
Yeah, and one more thing before I bring Elise in, which I'm sure is going to contribute towards the degenerative music, because there's lots to say about.
Did you say degenerative music?
It might as well be at some points as well.
The ones who are up to no good, those degenerates.
And it can sometimes manifest its way that way without realizing, actually. But I think it might be worth at this point also mentioning what's the function of music in, let's say, when you're scoring music to a film or a game. Because remember, in that kind of platform, the music is not the central thing necessarily. You're trying to use the music to enhance something going on in the picture, so it's playing its part. So some of the functions, for example, of music is to maybe like establish a place and time. Music is very good at that. So if you've got like an old piece, like a medieval piece, then you might use the kind of music we normally associated with that, to define a place or what have you. Similarly, it can communicate a character's kind of psychology as well. Music, if it sounds quite, it's got a tension towards it, it can also make someone feel a particular way. It's very, very powerful tool and all of that. So as a composer, you need to know all of that, and that needs to be factored into this intermix of all this kind of nonlinear music. So you can't just let it go like the way you just mentioned, where you said you can just leave a loop or a tape going and accidentally it can just do this or do that. You can't do that in games. You need to know that it's going to give you a certain type of feeling at a particular point, but at the same time is randomized. So you've got that kind of problem to solve as well.
Excellent. So then that's, I think, a good segue then to move over to Elise to say, if you could talk a little bit about generative, and also because one of the questions I had going into this is, how would you differentiate, say, generative to nonlinear? Because in some ways they seem complementary, some ways they seem like they are different. And so I'm curious how you would differentiate the two.
Yeah, absolutely. So so I'm really excited to talk about this. So I hope I get my thoughts in order, because I might just blur everything at once. So I'm trying to sort of keep it so it makes some sort of sense. So first of all, generative music, I would say, is a type of nonlinear music. And one of the things about generative music that is quite interesting is having to make a differentiation between music that you can hear is nonlinear. So you can tell that it doesn't ever repeat, or that there's some stochastic element, you're not quite sure, it's randomized or that sort of thing. But sometimes you can randomize something and it won't really make much difference. So if I took 5 notes of a pentatonic scale and randomized them and played them just randomly in any order, after a while, you wouldn't really think about whether it's random or not at the note level, because it would just sound like a sort of plinky plonk carrying on. So in that instance, even though it's randomized, it's non-linear, you're not, it's not following a score, it's not following a sequence, it doesn't really sound like it's non-linear because it just all blends in together. So I wanted to come back to, when we talk about generative music, we often bring in Brian Eno, because I think he actually coined the term. And one of his pieces, Music for Airports, it's more of a concept than a piece of music. So he triggers notes at different times, and then these notes repeat at different intervals. So a bit like the metronome score by Ligeti that you mentioned. And because of the different notes, you end up with lots of different chords, and it's absolutely beautiful, okay? And that's very generative, and it's a very simple concept, actually. And you can build it in all sorts of different platforms. You could build it in a game platform, you could build it in a data flow platform like Max MSP or Pure Data, you could build it in Wise, you could build it in anything, because it's a concept rather than a piece of music, okay? Now, the reason I mention that is because Brian Eno, we might all know, but the younger generation might not have heard of quite so much because he's not mainstream at the moment. So I wanted to try and bring those two things together. So if we think about a very popular open world game, okay, Minecraft, massive. Billions of people have played Minecraft. And that had a soundtrack, and the music was fantastic, beautiful. It really set the scene, it was very peaceful. It's very ambient, like if you talk about ambient music, again, it kind of relates to Brian Eno, talks about ambient music. And it always struck me that music is not programmed. They are pieces of music that are triggered at different points in the game. It would be just even the music itself lends itself to being generative. So you could take elements of that music and turn them into little stems or little elements that could be triggered at random times, and it would still sound almost the same, but it would never repeat, because those things are so random and you don't know quite all the different elements would trigger at different times. It would be, I don't know, 1 million years before it would actually repeat the same way again. So that would be a really fun project, actually, just to take the music, just to take one of those ambient pieces and turn it into that type of music. Not difficult to do, okay? And Minecraft, just to think about the popularity of that music, it's like the most streamed game music, I think, in Spotify. If you look at the statistics, it's actually something that's listened to most out of all the game soundtracks. And that's for a variety of reasons, but, partly it's very popular. So something like that, which lends itself to generative music, where you could trigger the notes, the sounds, in different orders each time, but still ostensibly have the same piece. That's what excites me. And then to go further, then to talk about Wise and using that to make nonlinear music, there is a game composer called Guy Whitmore who has written music for video games and mobile games, in fact, and he works in Wise, and he has actually written a whole album of music where there are so many stems and so many layers that they're all going to be triggered slightly differently every time you play it. So you'll never, although you'll be able to recognize it as the same piece, it will play slightly differently every time, giving you constant variety. It's like having an album of remixes that never gets old, kind of thing. And when he talked about this album, he stated he still hasn't quite figured out how to put this out. You know, how do I make this? It'll have to be some sort of app or a game. And I think this is where it starts to get really exciting, is that we have this concept of nonlinear music, and we know that it's in games, and people are getting more and more sophisticated about it in games. And we are even developing more sophisticated tools to compose it with. But in some respects, it's almost the output. And this is coming back to what Tony said about how, you know, in games, the music isn't the main thing, you know, it's part of a whole. So it has to sit in its place. But what if that music was the main thing? What if you sat down and listened to a nonlinear album, a generative album, where, you know, you could hear different things each time. So you might just be doing something else and then hear something, go, oh, I haven't heard that bit before, that's interesting, or I haven't heard that combination before. And I think that would be really exciting. And I was kind of hoping that maybe we'd figure out an app or something, because in a way, mobile phones are kind of the perfect device. So, you know, for CDs, we had CD players, for LPs, we had record players. So for generative music or for nonlinear music, or we have to decide on the word for it, we could just use our phone, because that has a computer in it. It can do this already. And we quite often connect it to speakers or headphones already. So that could be an interesting way forward. I'm just checking because I wrote some notes. Oh yeah, I think that's everything I was going to say. I've been talking for ages. I hope that made sense. I sort of went off a bit excitedly, but yeah, I don't know if you want to bring it back to what you wanted to talk about.
Well, what I thought might be, because, you know, we've talked about how, you know, clearly it's been started to get utilized in games, and I think that's going to certainly be the way forward in terms of, you know, it used to be, you know, if you think back to the old school, you know, original Nintendo, right? You know, that because what was funny is just a year or two ago, actually I've got one right here. My son gave me one of those old school, like, that has preloaded like 30 old school Nintendo games. So it's like, yes, back to the old school Zelda. I'm on it. And what I found remarkable was how amazingly repetitive the music is. But I remember when I originally first started playing it, and actually going back to it, I think it still holds up really, really well. How they created those 8-bar loops, 16-bar loops, whatever, are so just perfect. Because of course they were only dealing with 8 bits. I mean, they were so limited on the bandwidth they could give to the music. They composed it so well that it felt like that it was, yeah, sure, you know, looping to an extent, but it never felt like it was just the exact same thing over and over and over again. Basically, you've got one theme for the overworld and one theme for the underworld, and that's it. And now we're at this stage. So like they had to compose loops that would sound engaging and sound, you know, not as repetitive as they actually were. Now we're at the complete opposite end of the spectrum, where we are trying to look, how do we have these completely non-repetitive music sets that still feel that they're related to each other? You know, how do we create these, whether they're generative, whether they're interactive or adaptive, how do we create these musical sets so that they can continue to evolve and not sound like they're just kind of going off into space unrelated to each other?
I would like to add something potentially there as well. I mean, one of the things we should bear in mind as well is that nonlinear music has been around for longer than anything else.
Sure.
You know, because when we first were doing music without all this technology, and particularly the recording industry, as soon as we started to record things, we started to freeze dry, if you like, what music should sound like. And it would sound like the same again and again and again. And in a way, we appreciated the fact that when we play a record, for example, it would sound exactly the same. But before all of that, it was always going to be
different. Call and response is probably the original non-linear, almost, you know, the fact that if you know the whole act of call and response, you know, vocalizations, where you have something but then the response is always oftentimes improvised, and so it's not going to be the same answer every single time. You know, that way you're getting a similar thing, and that goes
Absolutely.
back to you know, folk music of, kind of prehistoric.
Gospel, you name it, and it's a direct form of interactive music, if you like, getting the audience as the player to get involved, as you to and from back and forward. So, that is something which has been around since eternity. So in a way, what we're trying to do now is use technology or modern technology to get that back, to get that participation back from the audience, or let's say the conductor, or if you're a rapper, and you're battling with somebody else, then let the music somehow adjust itself according to that. So I guess what me and Elise is kind of saying, that in games we're trying to stretch it back into that kind of realm where you have that participatory role from all the actors involved.
Excellent. I see Denise has got her hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to just throw something else in, which is basically a memory from 1979, where I was making huge tape loops in a 48-track studio and running them forwards and backwards and using different mixes of them. And also we did sound walks where I would go out and record the sounds through a busy street into a park. And one of the programs that I ran on a creative entrepreneurship masters a few years ago, at least sort of 6 or 7 years ago, there was a person who was doing exactly the same, but for a tourist. So looking at tourism by playing the soundscape of different places. And of course, everyone would have a different experience of a particular park where they might have lunch. And so this person was producing tracks for lunch for people who worked in cities to then be able to go into the park and hear not only the soundscape that was there, but also to then revisit that if they were somewhere else and thinking, I'd like to go back to, say, the Botanical Gardens, in Cambridge, and hear the soundscape. So in my lunch break, which is now in London, I can visit the soundscape of the Cambridge Botanical Gardens, which actually has been referenced, obviously, by Philip Pullman in all of his writing around, the dark materials and so on. So I just wanted to throw that in because I think that also is about non-linear music, but we are talking about a different tradition. Xenakis as an architect, John Cage, all of the music concrete stuff that's happening in France in the 70s. And I'm just, because I've obviously got a long time span to draw on, I'm just thinking to throw that in and looking at where has that got to. Brian Eno was mentioned, but these kinds of Xenakis as generative music through computer technology was happening in the 70s. And so it's not a new aspect. So I'm just wanted to throw that in the mix, really.
Fantastic. Thank you. Next, we'll go to Paul, who's got his hand up, and then Manolo after that, if that's okay.
So actually, sort of following on from Denise, I wasn't going to, but it's just struck me. If I think of non-linear music, the first thing I think of is wind chimes, because they are something that's totally, utterly non-linear, and there is a musical aspect to them. Now, there's a game designer that I adore called Iwai, and the Japanese do seem to go into this generative music much more than UK or US game producers do. So, if I could think of my favorite game designer, it's probably Mizuguchi, who did Sega Rally 2, but then he progressed onto Rez, which is all about music, Lumines, which is all about music, Every Extend Extra, which is all about the fusion of music and non-linear music, but also the blending of music and gameplay. But Iwai made a game called Electroplankton, which is completely generative. You create a very basic game level, and then you put musical chimes through this level. So it's kind of like musical pachinko to an extent, but very gamified. And that creates completely generative music. No level will ever sound the same. Now, in the UK and the US, we had a theme, and Europe as well, we had a theme in the 80s and 90s, which was mutating generative artwork. So we had the Kai Krauses and the William Lathams and the artists and the Richard Dr. Baileys, who made artwork through generative means. And Latham worked at one point with Eno, I think, to create a mutating art and music soundscape. And I think that there is, for me, the differentiation between non-linear music is music which changes relative to the gameplay that you've got. So you're playing Rock Band, you flub a few notes, you hear the audience begin to react, you start hearing the audience turn against you, you start losing people in your band. So that is non-linear, it's reflecting the game. Or you've got Electroplankton, where you are creating the soundscape around you, because that is the gameplay that you're making. And then the last point is, only because I don't want to go on too long, but why oh, terrible, my brain's gone. The creator Katamari Damacy were interested not just in games and music, but how they could extend that. And going back to what Denise was saying about soundscapes, the guy that made Katamari Damacy, oh no, I can't remember his name. That's absolutely horrific. That's terrible. Oh, Takahashi. So Takahashi got given money to make a child's playground, and part of what he made for this child's playground was the soundscape that the children's play objects made together. So the swings were effectively wind chimes. The merry-go-rounds were creating a harmony and a harmonic that worked around them. And he was saying that the music, the alpha state that music creates, and again, if you're making a game or if you're making an experience, you want people to become attuned to the alpha state as they're doing it. To do that, music, he felt, was one of these key factors to get somebody participating into the alpha state. And I think that what we can do, what I want to learn from you, what we can do is fabulous and phenomenal. But I think the generative, we create something which creates music. That's probably the most exciting thing to me.
Excellent. We're going to go to Manolo and then Kienda, but the one thing that I will kind of continue on, just kind of put a little bookmark following up from that, Paul, is also that what I love about this is the fact that we're talking about, music, nonlinear music, and how it can be used in games, and just enjoying it for, like what we'd call pure music, music that serves no other purpose than just to appreciate it. But I think after we check in with Manolo and then Kienda, I'm going to, and so maybe have people just have this in the back of your minds. What are maybe some real world applications that we could use this for too? Because I've got a couple ideas for ways, again, music doesn't have to have a purpose other than just to be music, but I've got a couple ideas, and I'm curious what other people might think of too. So we'll go to first Manolo and then Kienda.
So just a few things. Well, first of all, it's really interesting what you were saying, and I didn't know much about video game, even though I played, but never make music for video games. So, but I understand this logic that you guys are explaining. And but also, when you said non-linear music, for my mind was like, okay, if music is sound and silence in time, it's always going to be linear, okay, for the listening point of view. Okay, but then when you say non-linear, only from the composer point of view, you can see that it's non-linear, because then you use your whatever strategy to create it. So to make non-linear music, real non-linear music, means that everybody has to be composer. So in a video game, when you play, your action should trigger some events in music, okay? But one of the most important part of the game is the speed that you play. Okay, you can be kind of fast and aggressive, or slow and, and just wandering around. And that music should match this part. So Toby was saying about these two strategy. One is the layering, but the layering is always going to have the same beat, BPM. But the other one is the playlist is going to have maybe different BPM, right? So if you put the two things together, then you have a playlist that meets your speed, and then the other one that create variation, then you have something that is more in line with the player. Okay, so the player can interact and decide, what kind of a playlist and whatever is happening. But then I was also thinking that we are talking about the limit of this technology that we are using to create music. So if the ultimate generative music should be actually created by AI and not human. The human should give the prompt and say the music should have those feelings, those kind of sound. And then AI should analyze the player and say, I give you this. And to each player is going to have a different experience, different music. So I think the limit that we are talking here is the technology we're having that is not maybe ready to do the ultimate kind of interactive music, non-linear and generative music.
Can I quickly chime in there? Because there's a couple of things I think, Manolo, you said, which are actually is developed in games, which I'm not sure you're aware of. So in these middleware tools, you are able to change the speed as well of the music, so you can react to that. So what tends to happen is that you have the game engine, and that game engine is where the world is, if you like, is coming from. And when the player is playing the game, that game then communicates via a middleware tool called Wise or Fmod, and sends parameters, if you like, varying variables to that, and then it tells the music what to do in a way. So you can tell it to speed up or slow down or change something, or even be randomized. So that is going on. And then also there's one more thing which I'm not sure you're aware of, and I'm not sure if we've mentioned it just yet, and it's kind of with the generative side, which is a great example of this is No Man's Sky, this open world game where you have both the universe is created procedurally by the computer, and the sound design and the music. And you have there where AI is helping generating things, but because it's such a complex environment, rather than everything is just event-based, where an event is happening with just the player doing things, it's system-based stuff. So they basically, the AI is kind of learning the theme of the place, the colors, the general kind of theme. Are there large dinosaurs on this planet and what have you? And then it works out what kind of music is suitable for that. But then at the same time, and this is the added complexity, and I think you alluded to this, is that when you're listening to music, or when often we listen to music, we're all conditioned to what we call often functional harmony. So we kind of have a sense of where the music is going, from A to B. So very often you have these musical progressions, and very often when we listen to pop music, we kind of have this sense of expectation of where things should go next, so to speak. And what composers often do is play around with those expectations to create all kinds of emotions, if you like, So we break the rules when we want to introduce tension and not. And we're trying to feed in, let's say, procedurally generated algorithms, which are not AI, let's say. And then also we feed in maybe some AI components as well in there to make things happen. So those things have already been explored in games. But you're right. I mean, it could be a lot more going on there, and I can talk forever about this sort of thing. But yeah, that's just mine.
And just quickly, before we move on to Kenda, there's just one other thing I was going to add to that as well, Tony, from Manolo. In terms of, again, because you brought up a great point about what do you do when you have different tempos and, these different things, or even different, even if it's the same tempo, different rhythm patterns and whatnot. And for the piece that I discussed at the beginning, the web installation where there were 9 things. At first, I was really stuck about how to go about it, because the artist wanted there to be some rhythm to it. First of all, she wanted a clock ticking through the whole thing, and then naturally, and then she wanted she didn't basically want it to be a clock ticking and then 8 ambient layers. It's nice, but then it'd just be kind of wishy-washy. She wanted there to be some rhythm involved. And the problem I faced technologically is I'd have no control over when someone click on a square. And never mind that, even if they clicked it in time, which would be a miracle. But even if they had, again, this is like 2000, 2001, you couldn't count on any kind of broadband speed. And so there'd be a gap. And I was really up against it. And this is where, again, working with different people from, different backgrounds and even different industries can really help. I started spitballing ideas with my best friend, who is a graphic designer. And I was telling him about my problem, and I was like, how am I going to figure this out? And he said, this kind of sounds like a lot like layers in Photoshop, right? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, what if instead of you
Mute.
clicking on, exactly, instead of clicking creates a sound on, what if you're clicking a mute off? And so essentially, you know, I kind of drew just like a little diagram that is now being blurred. But basically, if you imagine, I drew like 6 different color lines. They're all playing at the same time, all completely beat matched, all completely running synchronously. But, you know, you start off with just only one that's audible because the rest of the channels are muted. And anytime you click on a new square, instead of that being a sound on function, it's a mute off function. And it's amazing how the simplest of ideas can absolutely just make everything work. And again, I talked to a number of different tech people, multimedia authors, musicians. We couldn't figure it out. And it was a graphic designer who he got it in one. He got it like within 5 minutes. So yeah, that's great. Kianda.
Yeah, wow. My mind has been completely blown. No, seriously, and excuse me for lowering the tone of the conversation by introducing law and business, because I call that the lowering of the tone. Wow, I mean, seriously, it's raising so many questions in my mind about things like, not, you know, it's the horrid subject of ownership and rights and so forth, about sort of both linear, non-linear, and generative, which is so exciting. And I've already found a number of articles which I'm just going to be up all night reading now. Crazy about that stuff. But it reminds me of a colleague I once had who was doing some work with a program called SuperClider, and was doing some work that was really interesting. It was about, he was creating ambient sounds that were supposed to be randomly generated by people walking through a corridor at Westminster University. His name's John Ecott. And he was doing some work around this and using programming in SuperClider in order to be able to generate these random sounds. And that's where he came to me one evening and started to talk about the ownership of this stuff. And I remember sitting there thinking, my God, this is really crazy. And it reminded me of a chapter in the book, The Age of Spiritual Machines by Ray Kurzweil, who was talking about the point at which machines can autonomously create sounds and music in a sort of generative way. And what then the question is about sort of ownership and rights, and how what's solving that problem encourage more composers to participate in the activities of creating nonlinear music, or generative music as it was. And I think that's an interesting one for me personally. I just wanted to share my excitement really about the fact that there is some work that we can really easily do around not only sort of talking about nonlinear music and how important it is in the games industry and various other creating environments and stuff, but also how much further it goes, how much deeper the subject is, and how many other things it affects, and how many other questions people have to start asking about the direction of travel when we start to talk about the more sophisticated that generative music is going to become, the more sophisticated technology that's used in order to create this, the gamification that then springs up in order to be able to sort of boost that. Then there's some really interesting economic questions that ultimately do then sort of think, that you need to crack. I would say that because I'm a lawyer, so I'm sort of self-interested. But the amount of money I think I could probably earn out of getting people out of this quagmire of difficulties about rights, disaggregating non-linear sounds and what have you. I mean, there are some very easy solutions which I won't go into here, but I want to in another forum now. Just absolutely sort of that up to Denise, is that there is definitely a question about identifying layers, rights in layers, and then how those layers relate to each other in order to make a complete sound. And Manolo talked about the fact that, which I thought was really interesting, is that last point you were making, Manolo, about the perception of the complete piece. that the perception of the complete piece by the person who's listening, the audience, that will always be a composition, even though it may never be repeated in that same way, it is. So, you know, one of the fundamental rules is about setting down permanent form, that thing. You can arguably that's not the case, but it is at some point going to be possible to do this. And then the question is about that being a composition, and it then begging the question, it's no longer non-linear in the mind of the person who's perceiving that occurrence, that phenomenon, that sort of phenomenological experience that, you know, will then be perceived as being something which is linear. It's just crazy. I'm just mind blown.
Excellent. And I'm going to get to Tony in just 1 second, because I see your hands up. I just want to kind of almost set up Ash to follow you, Tony, because something that Kienda said sparked something that I'd just been thinking about today because of something I saw last night in terms of Super Collider. So it was a perfect handoff there, Kienda, and the fact that you know, that program that is on everyone's lips right now, Chat GPT. A friend of mine, Richard Devine,
I was just about to talk about
that. Started using Chat GPT to write Super Collider scripts, and probably the same thing for C Sound and all of those text-based things. And so I was going to say, after Tony gets on, Ash, if you want to talk about maybe some AI aspects of that, that'd be great. I know we're going to delve more deeply into AI in a couple of weeks, but I think it's still a legit part of this conversation, how that comes about. But yeah, Tony, if you want to.
Yeah, I was just about to mention the what Kienda has been talking about related to OpenAI and that Chat GTP and many of the other assistive tools for creative professionals and others who are not necessarily creative professionals. So if those who are slightly not aware, basically ChatGPT is like a chat bot you would normally, you know, sort of talk to on online, you know, when you sort of say something on a website, you know, how are you? And then you repeat back. But this is, let's say, a chat on steroids where, you know, whatever you're saying, it would really kind of know the context of what your question is. And then also remember that context if you write any sort of follow-up questions based on that. And what a lot of people have found with that is that, yeah, you can write dissertations with this kind of thing. You can even write code with it as well. So you can produce websites, et cetera, et cetera. And this is where a lot of people have now come up with the notion of who does it belong to, towards Kienda's point. And I think this is where the law needs some way to catch up and keep an eye on this, because I would say currently, and we've been using this a lot as music producers, it's been coming in by stealth. So for example, when we mix, we've been using tools like Isotopes to give us suggestions, if you like, of what to turn up or what to turn down in the bass, for example, in our mixes. Right. And or even Cthulhu, you know, so as a compositional tool, we've got tools which can give us suggestions in terms of what chords we can use next.
Or the probability packs, you know, for Max for Live that are in Ableton, where, you know, it will generate some chord progressions, and, you know, who owns that?
Absolutely. So in a way, what we're looking at here is augmented reality. You know, we're looking at ways of augmenting our thing. I mean, you know, like Steve Jobs has said, you know, the computer's kind of like the bicycle of the mind now. So, you know, we don't have to run to work. We take a car to go to work, you know. So those are our wheels, if you like, our extended legs. We wear glasses, some of us, you know, and there again, you know, like bionic people, we're able to augment our own eyes, you know, so we can see what we wouldn't naturally be able to see. Yeah, absolutely. And we're doing that all the time. So in a way, you know, many of our creative tools have become like that. I had that similar conversation to the founder, one of the co-founders of Wise, you know, the middleware tool. I asked him, you know, so where's the next step of this kind of stuff? And he's talking about, because of the complexity of the workflow, it's like a DAW Wise is. The next step of that is just building in a lot of AI assistive technology. So it seems like you're flying a plane with a lot of autopilot on. So that all these complex styles and all that, you don't have to, you know, you just have to just hold that steering wheel and think you're flying. But really, the plane is flying itself, you know, just giving you the impression. So I believe a lot of these tools and a lot of the ways, particularly a lot of modern producers are writing these days, by using tools like Splice, for example, or other tools. They're kind of making collages of pieces which are set. And some of these collages, if you like, might be also machined for you, with your own kind of personal preferences. And in a way, what we're left with is us as curators of selecting pieces and maybe cobbling together pieces of suggestions coming from elsewhere. So when it comes down to who does that belong to, that's a interesting question too.
And I think it depends on the creator, but I would argue still that a lot of that ownership still falls upon the person providing the stimulus for the AI, or providing it, because of the fact of sure, there's always going to be exceptions, but most composers and producers that I know were such control freaks over every little thing that basically what we'll do is, sure, we'll use a generative tool or a nonlinear tool to maybe get some ideas, but then we still kind of cut out our favorite bits, right? We'll still, it might have spat out an 8-bar thing that sounds like this. Well, I'm still going to chop it up and do it. And it's the same way that, for instance, Schoenberg, with his tone rows and his serialism, he had all these rules. He still broke his own rules from time to time just because he wanted it to sound a certain way. And, I did the same thing when I, learned about serialism or other kind of, more equation type rule set, based composition. You always kind of start off with that. And it's like, that sounds great. But if I just change this one note to that, it'll be even better.
Well, Kendall might know of this one, but I know of one case, and I was actually in the room when this was happening, where one record label was going out trying to sue another company for nicking its playlist. And that caused a real kerfuffle. Who does that playlist belong to? Because they had a playlist under their name on Spotify, and then other people then tried to copy that playlist. And who does it belong to? Because the music doesn't belong to them.
Right, it's the order of the
way that they're arranged.
Because with Spotify as a playlist, there's nothing that they're doing other than creating an order. It's not even a DJ mix where they've got control over the mixing, the blending, the cutting back and forth. They're completely just doing a set of track order, essentially. Yeah,
and they were almost basing their brand on that playlist, and they got really cheesed off, and then that led to a kind of lawsuit. Obviously I'm not going to mention the name.
But what's interesting about that is, and sorry to cut in, really sorry, but yes, I do know, but there's not only been one, but there's been tons of people arguing the same thing, and the question that arises, which is really interesting about that, is that certain if you're arranging songs, those songs they exist as compositions in their own right. And what you're doing is effectively arranging them in a certain way. And the question for a legal question is, how much does that contribute as skill and effort to a creation of an original work? And if you can't say that there's an original work that's being created, then copyright will not subsist in that work. And because it's just an arrangement of different other pre-existing, individually already protected works. And actually what you're doing is you're presenting facts, and it's like the similar case in AT&T, the telephone company, producing the telephone directory and trying to sue somebody else for producing another telephone directory, when all it is a directory of facts, right? Mr. Smith lives at number 45 wherever you go. That's the person who lives there. So anybody who documents that is not actually doing anything new, but simply regurgitating a fact, right? So when you're putting a number of different compositions together, these exist, right? So what you're doing is just hanging them together, right?
Well, then John Cage, though, took it a step further, where he did performances where he would simply recite the phone book from a lecture.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that there's so many interesting questions about, it really challenges everything from what is originality. So you're absolutely right, Tony, when you talk about the legal system having to deal with these issues within the new realm of music production, because they are challenging questions. The question of originality has always been a challenge, right? Whenever judging these issues, even more so now that if you're talking about, incidentally, I can imagine I started to to think when Elisa was talking about generative music that actually at some point in time you might not necessarily repeat a phrase or whatever, but you sure as hell going to come close to something that already exists, even on a balance of probability. Mathematically, when you're doing this, it's going to sound, someone's going to say, hang on a minute, that sounds like what I did. Like, I'm going to sue somebody for that, right? Seriously, because even though it just came up by some kind of random coincidence, it's going to sound similar. So you're going to have a sort of Ed Sheeran type action, sort of based on the fact that somebody thinks it sounds a little bit like this. The tempo might be different, the harmonics might be different, there might be different aspects of that. But nonetheless, I can see cases where people do challenge on the basis of that. And it's going to be, I'm excited. I mean, I don't know whether I'll go back into law now just to sort of specialize in nonlinear music.
Just to clean up. Just
to become the expert in this field. But actually, it is exciting because that's the direction of travel. If Ray Kurzweil is right, and I have every belief in his future chronology, which is an incredible thing to read, by the way. And Kate Kurzweil as well, you recognize the name associated with music, synthesizers and so forth. But as a futurologist, this chronology is talking about, AI, the people who prompt AI to make something, and that cuts to your point that you were making, Matt, whether or not that's where the copyright subsists, who the copyright resides with, and at what point that power moves and shifts to the actual AI itself. It's crazy.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's again, you should go pro there, Kenda, because that was the best way ever to pull back to Ash, who we did promise we'd get into AI. I'm going to get to you after that, Manolo, if that's okay. It's just that we'd already kind of set up Ash to drop in about AI a little bit. So you still there, buddy?
Yeah, I'm here.
Hey,
I'm
man, how's the
taking
packing
it
going?
all in, man. It's proper. It's wicked conversations, man. Proper cool. So, right, I think Manolo had said something super cool, and so just to give everyone a little bit of context, I've been digging up into AI very, very heavily, just like most people, but I've been really trying to break it in all aspects, in best ways possible. I've been trying to come at it from, really pushing its boundaries as an artist, and doing some really cool stuff. I've even, you mentioned ChatGPT. I know you mentioned Tony about it being a chatbot. I've trained myself, in the evenings that I'm talking to a person. The other night I was in my bed and I had a full-blown conversation with it for an hour just to see if it's really, it feels like it's a person. And yes, there are some elements that it obviously doesn't make you feel that way, but it's very, very intuitive. And I think coming back to the non-linear music and the gaming, Manolo said something really, really important, which is for this to really progress and really get interesting, it's the user that has to define the prompts, which are not going to be words or it's going to have to be what happens within the game, that they're going to be the automatic prompts that determine the randomness of everything. And I think when it starts getting interesting is when, and this is going to sound crazy, but when there's no longer needed for prompts and something is generated, but then that's a whole nother conversation of creating a consciousness that doesn't need it. But the games that I've seen that I grew up with, that I love, like open world games, I remember playing, ninja games, Tenchu and Metal Gear Solid, and how these had very, very distinct sounds and noises and stuff. And I think when we come to non-linear sounds, it really has to be in an immersive situation where there actually isn't much of a narrative within a game. If we really want to get into these, the true meaning of non-linear music within a situation, is we've got to remove that you basically want so that you're playing a game and if someone else is playing the same game, if someone's playing it further than you, that they can't spoil what's happening next, because that's obviously a linear situation. And it really has to be open. But I think that we're still at we're still scratching the surface with this AI. There's various arguments of whether it's good or bad. I'm just staying really open-minded about it all, because I think if we start utilizing it from now and start understanding it as creatives, I'm already using it to my advantage, which a lot of people aren't, which is, that's just the way it is with some people. But I think AI as a whole, it's the person behind that. It's the human behind the prompts or the one generating whatever we're generating is going to be the key factor here. And whether that is worded prompts, whether that's actions on a joystick or a keyboard, or whether that is us making sounds or turning our heads in a virtual world to trigger off various elements, that is what's going to be I think the key,
Absolutely. Thanks for that, man. And I completely agree with you. And I do, at least up until this point, I still believe, it's the one kind of giving the prompts that's still kind of in the driver's seat. Now that might change. And I know when we had a similar discussion at Metropolis about this, I think the gauntlet was thrown down where Tony and Elise are going to try to create a DJ bot that's going to, do Carl. And also, as I mentioned, I don't think that their bot should be able to just go straight to the boss level. I think it needs to work its way up, maybe beat a few students in a sound clash. Ash, I think you and I should definitely be some sub bosses that has to beat before it can, challenge for the belt. But I think it'll be really interesting to see how that unfolds. Go ahead.
I just wanted to add one more thing. I think also that, especially now when it comes to AI, where it's gonna, like, where I believe it's gonna start getting very interesting is when one thing starts affecting the other. And what I mean by that is exactly what a kind of Manolo was saying, that it's what something would look like in the virtual world would then become whatever it would be, and then that would trigger off a whole randomization of what the sounds would be like, or it's almost like the DNA of something which is completely unique and random. If you decide to be in a particular, if your prompt or whatever is done in a particular way, that is going to manifest in a very random and unique way the world in which it sits in. It's not going to just be, okay, you want a banana sitting on a tree, so you're going to get a yellow banana sitting on a tree. It's going to be looking at your voice, listening to your voice. It's probably going to understand the various aspects of who you are in order to determine those very random things that we see in real life. And I think when one starts affecting the other to that degree, I think that's when it starts becoming a little bit more interesting, but also quite scary.
Definitely. Well, let's go to Manolo, and then I was gonna just maybe put a couple ideas about some more real world non-musical applications of this, and then also we'll talk a little bit about the master's program as well, because this is the type of thing that we're wanting to do in our master's program, is to take these types of ideas, to take these types of forums, and really bring in students from all over to answer these questions, to try to create something that will help push these discussions further, but also create in the process. So Manolo.
Okay, just two quick things. One, regarding what Ash was saying, and for me, my how I see this, the user be the prompt, because that is the music, the game should be around the user. It should be work like more or less how blockchain works, that you log in with your identity into the game, so you bring yourself there with all your characteristics, all your history, and then you are the prompt. So the game is going to read everything out of you and then generate what is needed, from sound to music to the game itself and whatever is needed. Instead, what I wanted to say to Kenda, sorry. I really love your passion for law and all those copyright and so on. And it is fascinating for me because I'm exactly the opposite, and I can't wait. That we as a human, we understand the idea of ownership and copyright is wrong, it should end. And I think with AI, all those things, we are getting closer and closer. Nevertheless, we can be best friends. I really love your passion, and it's great.
but that, yeah. Anyway, that's good.
One thing I wanted to bring up. I see Tony and Paul both have your hands up, so feel free, to take what I'm about to say and run with it or ignore it. Either way. But one idea that I was thinking about in terms of other applications of this type of technology and this type of creativity is kind of taking what Elise was talking about with Eno's music for airports. And I think that it can actually be used, this type of work, whether it be for within large public spaces, or whether it be sitting on the phone with that annoying hold music that is usually too loud, distorted, and loops too often. But what I was thinking about, especially like in we'll take airports, since that's what wrote for. Usually when people right, when things get crowded, there's too many people, they're too packed together. That's when tempers start to flare a little bit. That's when people start to become more verbally abusive to airline staff and whatnot. One possibility that you could have with this type of technology, kind of riffing off of the model, is you could use infrared sensors that basically could tell how much body heat is in the room. So the more body heat there are, it knows that there are more people, and therefore it can slow down the tempo of the music. It can make it more placid and more calming to help, involve with crowd control. And people won't notice that that's what's happening, but you can use kind of that psychosomatic idea behind it. Same thing, if you're on hold, the longer you've been on hold, anyone, who thinks about it for 2 seconds will know you're probably going to get more and more frustrated. The music hopefully could get more and more calming, and ways to try to use that adaptive type of technology, use that type of nonlinear technology. I think that's a way. So a bunch of hands just went up. So as I said, feel free to take that lead as an idea to run with, or to switch directions, but I'll just go in order on my screen. So we'll do Tony, Paul, Elise, Stephen, Kienda. Wow.
Okay, so I'm going to partially answer your last part, but I'm going to do that second. So the first part is what sprung up from I can't see his name here. But the part about when you're talking about prompts and learning from machines, I think that's very interesting. But bear in mind, when you're putting music in a game or in a film, it's often regarded as negative art. And what I mean by that is that the less you're aware of that music, the better it actually is doing its job. Because we often talk about the immersive behavior as when you're playing this game, you're immersed in this game. The last thing you want to go away with is, oh, how great that music was, unless the music had that purpose of, sort of distinguishing itself outside the box. So that is one important thing to bear in mind when you talk about that kind of stuff. The other thing is about when you're talking about prompts in a game, again, I advise you to go to No Man's Sky, because that is an incredible application of that kind of thing, where they've modeled a world of physics as well. So you have a very emergent behavior coming from the music and everything else based on the way you're playing the game. So it's a kind of unique experience for each of the players out there. And what you're coming away with is very much tailor-made for your personality. And I think to take that further, and I think Manola, that was the name I was trying to refer to, Manola, what Manola's saying as well is that we're often faced with a lot of machine learning algorithms now, which are already modeled our behavior and sometimes even know more about us than we really think we know about ourselves. And a lot of these tools are also then ingested in these machines, and it can actually suggest musical ideas and kind of immersive ideas as well in that creative process. So I think sprinkling a little bit of that is a very powerful thing. And my last point is towards your point, Matt, regarding using sensors, because this is something which really excites me, because in a previous startup company, this was something we looked at, where we come up with the idea of the soundtrack of your life is something where all these kind of wearable devices you're wearing are sending messages like real-time parameter controls, something we use in a lot of these middleware tools, to then suggest information to how that music should be. So if you're walking fast or your heart is at a particular tempo, the music is reacting to that, or the sound effect is reacting to that. Like you said, the weather, where you are, your watch might say, well, actually in 10 minutes time, it might rain. So then again, the music could segue or position itself in that kind of way. So there's a lot of possibilities in that sphere, and it's not too far off. To talk about another sci-fi person, which Kianda mentioned, is William Gibson, who often talks about that the future is here, already here, but not evenly distributed. So it depends where you are, how much you want to see that future right now. And we have these tools to do a lot of this stuff right now. And it's very, very exciting if you're a game developer, because you're working alongside all these other artists, in a very collaborative way to create a lot of these kind of things. So it's a perfect mismatch between arts and science and philosophy, you name it, law as well. And it's a perfect playground for master's research programs. Excellent.
We'll move on to Paul.
So it's only a quick point. It sort of follows on a bit from what Ash said, and I think a couple of people have alluded to as well. But when I think of AI, I primarily think of AI art, because it's been coming in for the past 18 months, 2 years or so. And the problem is the massive amount of pushback there is towards AI art from anyone who uses it or mentions it on social media. So in the same way that NFTs have become a toxic property, in the same way that AI has become a toxic art discussion. So ArtStation recently, all of the artists that run it, the predominant amount put no to AI art, because ArtStation wanted to put an AI art prompt on there. And there was a huge amount of kickback. One of my favorite living artists is a guy called Dave McKean, and he's a phenomenal artist. And as an art level of interest, he made an illustrated book only using AI art. And the book itself is not his best artwork. And it's a fascinating read, but the amount of negative audience customer feedback to him has led him to say he probably won't use AI again, because the debate is toxic before you even start. There was a South Korean artist called Kim Jong-ji, who died over Christmas, sadly. Phenomenal comic artist. And somebody programmed an AI art generator to keep creating art in his style. And that person got instantly a huge amount of hostility online and social media, because it was seen as being extremely disrespectful and extremely uncomfortable, the idea of this computer carrying on Kim Jong-ji's legacy. So I am hugely interested in the possibilities that AI art can create in artwork, in games, in the generation of games artwork by people who aren't necessarily artists, like programmers, for example. But I think we've got to be absolutely mindful of the fact that it is a toxic swamp of negative pushback at times. And but my first thought is, I really want to teach AI art in the classroom with especially the programming students. And my second thought is, but I do not want to put them in that position where that can become suddenly something where they find themselves vilified for something which is just art exploration.
I think you raise a great point there, Paul, and I absolutely know where you're coming from with that. And I think part of our responsibility then is to help change the discussion. And when we keep referring to AI as a tool rather than a crutch, I think that's where we get to it. Because anytime there's been a development along these lines, people come out of the woodwork to decry about how there's too much of a crutch. And now it can range from anything from, take, what do you call it? On the Serato for the turntables, all of a sudden everyone thought, well, now you don't have to know how to beat match, and so anyone can DJ. No, it just means that the part that was actually the easiest part of being a DJ has just been taken out of the equation, and now it's going to be much more about your creativity, about your craft, about how you can create a set that no one else can create, how you know how to read a crowd, how you know how to, your encyclopedic knowledge of music, so you know even what to pull from. That's I think the thing. And these types of things, again, whether it be technology based or procedural based, whether it be something like Jackson Pollock, everyone always likes to say, oh, my kid can do that because it's just splatter art. But what's been really interesting is the fact that no one can truly recreate what Jackson did, because they've done studies about looking at the fractals of his work, and the closest that they've come to reproducing what Jackson did is to dip a branch in paint and have it hanging in the wind. And that was the closest that they've come to recreating the minutiae levels of fractals that he was able to create. So I think part of our responsibility as creatives and as kind of thought leaders in these industries is we have to change the narrative. If we don't like what people are saying about it, then we switch it up on them. And I will then hand it off with that in mind to Elise.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Yeah, it's funny because actually I was going to try and bring in a kind of more positive AI note and tie a few different things in together. So something that Ashwin said was about music it should be able to itself make something that is absolutely personal and relevant to us. In whatever interaction it is. There's lots of ways people are investigating that. So we talked about wearables, and I was part of a research group where we built a proof of concept game where you had to wear a galvanic skin response measurer. So it measured basically how much you were sweating, and also your heart rate. And basically, as you played the game, if it got a bit tense, you could choose whether to either, make the music more exciting to really build on that feeling, or you could calm the music down to stop them getting too overexcited. So there's these decisions to be made as to what the music is going to be doing. Is it going to enhance that emotion, or are you going to pull it back, like you're saying about the airport, measuring the room temperature? You want to calm people down and that sort of thing. But leading on from that, having talked about heart rate and galvanic skin response, if we are going to try and, if AI, and this is where I'm moving to AI now, if AI is going to figure out what humans want in terms of music, we're going to basically have to try and work out how you quantify a human being. And this goes back to discussions we had at Metropolis about, what are all the different things you can measure in a person. And yeah, you can put them all in an algorithm. And maybe if you measure enough things, how many times they've eaten, how much they exercise, have they slept well? Maybe at that point, you might start to build a very personalized emotional connection through AI. And I don't think it will come from the art world. I think we will be matching this. Hopefully what will happen in the master's program, people will bring ideas together. So for example, I know a company right now who are using machine learning, that they gather information off a wearable, exactly that. They gather information off a wearable and they use machine learning to work out over time their stress levels. And the idea is that over time, when they've got so much data, they will actually be able to recognize patterns and then determine if your stress levels are going to go up because of a situation. Okay, so that's kind of that is a machine learning, that is AI doing that. And there's no reason then, if all these medical and health companies are actually building these tools, why we can't then bring them over into art and say, well, actually, I would like to take this data and make some music out of it because I think this will have a particular effect in this situation. So it's coming back around. And then my last thing I just want to say about AI, we need to remember that at the moment, AI is very, very good at doing very, very specific things. So it can do something very well, but it's very specific. And I think because art is so multifaceted, and art and I include music, it is very difficult to talk about an AI that can do all the things that we require of it. And we'll have to perhaps combine lots of different AIs that have come from all sorts of different research fields in order to make something that will be of a kind of AI creation, if you see what I mean.
Absolutely. And I think building on that, just briefly before we go to Stephen and then Kienda and then Manolo, is that so far the one thing that AI doesn't seem to have is the ability to self-critique. And I think, oftentimes, well, as artists, that's usually what drives us to create that, something that was perhaps previously pretty good. We're not satisfied with it, and we just keep at it and keep at it and keep at it because we keep telling ourselves, oh, that's a bit of crap, until we make that breakthrough. And sometimes it's by going in a complete opposite direction. Sometimes it's by saying, what happens if I just take out all these things and slow it down by 20 BPM, reverse it? Oh wow, that's just totally tripped it on its head. Now I've got all these new ideas. Now I can get on it. So far, an AI doesn't have that capability. Stephen.
Yeah, hi everyone. Matt, you were talking about the use of sensors and being a design and technologist for God knows how long. I just thought about a project that the actual students could do, and it touches on a bit of what you said, Elise. And if you click on that document and scroll down to number 12, I thought about you could use an Arduino control unit to with a simple heart rate monitor that normally would be used to measure BPM, but as Elise kind of touched on, that heart rate monitor could be used to influence the actual gameplay and audio systems in an actual game engine like Unreal Engine or something like that. So you can actually, there are ways you can actually link and output 0 to 5 volts into a game engine to actually create that mood or tension, like you say, when you're in the mode of playing a game. So it's a possibility. So it's just giving me an idea randomly. I was thinking about a project brief and also something for me to add to my to make list of things for Kane to and obviously the other skills they're going to learn from it's multiple skills really they're going to learn from that, as well as the manufacturing, and then they can decide if they're going to do the design, the audio side of the coding, the manufacturing using 3D printing, or just outright program if they want to just do that as well. So, but using the sensors to influence the gameplay, I think is a key thing, or something. I don't know if anyone's actually looked at that before. It was just a random thought.
I think that's a fantastic idea. I don't know of it being used, but it perhaps might have. What I am going to do is before we go into Kenda, just use this opportunity to say, first of all, thank you, everyone. This conversation has been incredibly stimulating and really inspiring, and it seems other people have been feeling the same way. So I'm really excited about that, and I'm really excited about the series that we've got planned. So I just want to use the opportunity to say, I hope that people will return next week so we can continue on with these conversations. Next week, we'll be looking at immersive sound. But yeah, this has been absolutely fantastic, and I'm glad that people have been just as excited and energized about everything as I have. So we will move on to Kienda, please.
Yeah, yeah, I absolutely concur. It's amazing. Still blown, still mind blown, and still excited. But there's a couple of things. One is I'm not sure where we might be able to find information about this, but I do know that British Telecom, BT, some time ago, did some work around creating ambient office sounds that was supposed to be, again, changeable dependent upon the atmosphere in the office. The idea being that you create some kind of, they're working through a number of algorithms to find ways, that represent sort of harmonious office working environments, fused with a bit of music, but even with phone sounds and various different other things. And the more people that came into the room, or rather the more people that left the room, the more that sound would still remain in order to compensate for the fact that people were leaving. Do you know what I mean? And I can't remember when it was. It must have been at least 20 years ago or something that I was hearing about this, that there was work being done, and they might even have been using SuperCollider then, coding in order to be able to use that kind of, or to create that kind of reaction or that kind of response. The other thing I wanted to say about related to our students and what we tell them, and what Paul was saying, which again is very, very interesting. But, for me, this is the direction of travel. This is cutting edge stuff. And so we should absolutely be talking to our students about this, but also allowing them the tools to think about the kind of things that we've been talking about. What if, what then, what happens in the future? And, yes, there will be, there'll be people who will push back on it. But, in some ways, if we think about history, there's always been people pushing back against technological advancement, right? But, again, I quote Ray Kurzweil because, I'm a mad fan. And if you get a chance to read The Age of Spiritual Machines, you'll see why. Because, there is nothing going to stop singularity. It will occur. And at that point in the future, we will have to ask ourselves about sentient AI and what that means in relation to creativity, consciousness, decisions, and self-critique. Because the idea is that at some point in time, that's going to happen. Now, I'm not sure how long it's going to take before that happens, but I do know that we need to do the work now in terms of within the field of education. Otherwise, we really will be missing a trick, if we're not sort of preparing our students to go into a world and be able to solve problems using an understanding of at least where things are headed. Because these are going to be huge questions in the future. We're talking about, I firmly believe that, AI will be autonomous at some point. And we need to be ready for that period. We need to understand what the implications of that actually is. And when we talk about what Ash was talking about, when one bit of AI becomes the prompt for another bit of AI, and then you start to see that whole movement out, then we're no longer the masters of the technology. And the question about use of tools that Matt referred to earlier, we can all be safe and comfortable in our beds thinking that actually technology is a tool. That's really great. But there's going to come a point, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Colossus, a really old 70s movie about, you should look it up. It's incredibly, incredibly telling. And I often use it as one of the very first examples of, the fear of AI, when the machine suddenly turns around and says through a speaker, "What is love?" We've got to shut the thing down. We've got to shut it down. There's this whole scene where they're trying to pull the plug on the shit. But this thing has been responsible for designing mining programs for the bottom of the sea, and realizes that humans are harmful to themselves. And so it needs to. Anyway, I go off. But the point I'm making is in relation to students and an MA program, at that level, there should be that level of challenging thought.
Absolutely.
And thought about what the future holds. And there should be no fear. And I hear Paul, and I totally understand Paul, what he's saying about the pushback. But I think our job is to prepare those warriors to move this discussion forward, and not to be afraid, or at least to be armed with why. Why it's important to explore these areas, why it's important to understand what the implications are. And when I talk about the legal implications, again, imagine I'm thinking the most amazing opportunities to think about collaborative projects, to create works that examine not only how the technology will be used and enhanced in future, but what are the legal implications, what are the questions for the business, how does that help people in their sort of entrepreneurial activity when they're trying to do things. So my thing is, we arm the students, arm the students with the knowledge, and we make them march forward with it in spite of whatever kind of pushback because they will use it.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because this topic, nonlinear music, is actually one of the topics that one of the master's students that just graduated did his 702 project on. I'm very proud to say that I was his supervisor. I don't know what grade he got on that. I'm just assuming that if it was good, that it was clearly all of my doing and supervision that led that type of excellence. But no, but what he did is he created a room where the user can walk around in a 3D space, including jumping. So you've got the all three axes, and then create different size balls that would create a different tone or it would trigger a sound. And I think the duration of the sound was dependent on the size of the ball that you created, but then also it would bounce off of different walls, and then you created all these different soundscapes. And one thing that I kind of talked to him about, and he didn't take it completely far, because again, the 702 is more about a proof of concept, but that whole idea can be, and bring it back to using AI as tools. This is how we can use nonlinear music, AI, but then again, focusing on using it as a tool almost in real time rather than just giving AI prompts. If you put yourself in a space like that, you could actually compose that way through these gestures, through, sending out different objects in real time that occupy in a 3D space, digitally, that trigger sounds, and how you react to that in real time through those gestures, then keeps the composition going. These are different ways that we can, as I said, help reframe the argument about these ideas are just tools that we are able to harness for our own creativity, and that actually we are still the ones in the driver's seat. In this, I know I saw that shrug, Kianda, and I'm just maintaining that for as long as I can. I'm sure I'll be proven wrong sooner than later. But
you hang on to that thought. Hang on to it.
For the 5 minutes remaining that'll remain relevant, right? I know we got to wrap up a little bit, so we've got 3 hands up, and then we'll wrap it up for tonight, and then so that we can hopefully channel this continued energy into next week. So we've got Manolo, Tony, and then we will wrap it up with Ash. Ash, tying it up like the boss man that he is. So can we, first go to Manolo.
Okay, thanks. So no, I just want to conclude by advocating for the exact opposite of what I've been saying so far, because I think it's the right thing to do. And in somehow this idea of having like individual customized experiences is a kind of an enemy of a common culture. Okay, so where like as a pop culture, we need to live the same thing. So we have similar experiences. So we connect with each other and we understand each other. Okay, so all what we said so far is individualism, going towards just one person, one single experience, one single reality that nobody else knows about it. So something to think about. And then we need more tough law, just to say the opposite of what I said so far. So that's it. That was my point.
But isn't that the mark of a great conversation, where you can enter the conversation, from one angle, and then you exit the conversation going out the exact opposite way? And some of my favorite conversations have had that effect.
I got both opinions in my mind. It's not like I have to choose one. Okay, I have those reality and more than two in my mind.
Absolutely, Tony.
Yeah, so I want to make 2 points real quickly here. So the first one, because Kianda was talking about the impact of these technologies in the future, but I would say, and I'll go back to it again, that the future is now. These conversations are happening now because people are using this stuff now. And so when you think about the AI, I would say, how would you know it's AI? So to go to Paul's point, for example, I've heard many instances where AI has produced works of art which people had said, ascribed all these passions or attributes which are human-like, and they may not be. It's just that we have kind of rendered it in our minds to think it's being done by a human when it might have been done by a machine. So machines are already causing havoc out there, whether they're writing fake news stories or doing X, Y, Z. Similarly, with musical melodies, we might be already dancing to the beats of some AI already and not realize that, you know, most of it was generated by AI. So I would say that we're dealing with the present right now. And yeah, we must embrace and also have this conversation with the students. The other point, which I think is very important, we haven't mentioned, is accessibility with this kind of tool as well. There are many people who are left out of this conversation, really, because, but we can bring them in through accessibility. So, for example, one of the tools of nonlinear music is the way you can communicate, use music to communicate information. So you could be blind, for example, and the music could be giving you indications about where you are, for example, or even enhance so-called able-bodied people to do things they weren't aware they were able to do, so augment their own reality. So as an accessibility tool, a lot of these tools we've been talking about so far, immersive technologies, nonlinear music, etc., can be used to help the blind and many other people who might be partially impaired. So just those 2 points.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tony. And Ash, do you want to close us out?
Yes. Well, thanks, guys. I don't know about closing out, but I've definitely got, you know, a big point to make, and it kind of jumps from what everyone said, what Paul said, especially what Tony has just said about technology. And I want to just share with you a story of when I was studying art at GCSEs and at A levels. And obviously it's all traditional art. And when I discovered the Wacom tablet, my art teacher said I was crazy. All right. And I remember this because I was told that what I was doing on a Wacom tablet was not art. And when you look at technology now, I think, and then the reason why I'm drawing a reference to this because this is the second turning point of me doing art in my life, where AI now is another form, another technology that's allowing me to be creative. Like, first of all, it was me doing traditional artwork, then doing the Wacom stuff, which now, if you look, probably every single comic book artist is using a digitizer, whether it's an iPad, a Wacom Cintiq, whatever it might be. So it's now gone to that level 20 years later, where now art has been accepted on something where, in a traditional sense, 20 years ago, I was told that that's not going to be the future of art. I do believe that there are the fundamentals of art, and I do believe in that. You know, you've got to understand how to draw, you've got to have these understandings of color, but in terms of how you draw and how you interpret that, I still think that technology will always win. And definitely in regards to what everyone's saying, I second the point that it needs to be talked to students. I cannot wait till I can sit in front of a student and show them what I have done, but more importantly, show them how to utilize it correctly within their art, and to not lose, the traditional sense of doing things that has been the foundation of what is art, which is, it is drawing, it is those things, but technology is a great way of interpreting these various different ideas that sometimes they don't come along. It takes the computer to make you see it differently, and then suddenly it gives you another idea to generate it. So I just remember that, and I wanted to share that with everyone, because this is the second turning point in my life as an artist, that something as beneficial as AI, which I'm totally don't fully understand it yet, but it's getting there, and I'm enjoying the process because it reminds me of using that Wacom tablet and trying to experiment, and it's definitely at that stage for me at the moment. So I just wanted to share that with everybody.
Excellent. Well, thank you. And I think that's actually a great place to wrap it up. This has been absolutely fantastic. This has been, really stimulating. I'm glad that everyone has seemed to enjoy it just as much as I have. And I think all these points are great in the fact that it's great to, take these ideas, but then, now the, great thing is by being at a university, and specifically a university, that has the kind of freedom that ACM has, this is where we can really help students totally thrive and blossom into these new futures that I think even us old crusties who've been around the block a few times and know a few tricks, I think it's going to be really exciting to see what the new generation comes up with. Is there anything that you want to add, Denise, before?
I'd just like to say it's great that you've all engaged. I'm really, really pleased. This is the first one of a series, and I really want this to start to really move us into the space of knowledge exchange. This is a free and open discussion. Anyone can join, and the thought leaders are amongst the people that join, as well as the people that are working every day as ACM staff. And we want to share these conversations with a much wider group. And we also want to encourage a number of different perspectives on master's students, professionals coming in to work on questions like these. So I'm delighted with the first one. It's been great. I've really enjoyed the session, and it's been great to hear what people have got to say. So thank you and have a great evening. And I'm looking forward to next Monday already.
Yeah, I hope to see everyone come back next week. And please do invite your friends and colleagues. The more the merrier. This has been absolutely fantastic. So just a reminder, next week, Monday, the 16th of January, we will be looking at the topic of immersive sound. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much. Have a lovely rest of the evening.
Thanks a lot, guys. Bye-bye.